Have you ever wondered what happens when the weight of a family name is so immense it suffocates one's own identity? What if the villain you despise was, in fact, a prisoner of a legacy he never asked for? Prepare to unravel the deepest layers of Draco Malfoy, the boy behind the sarcasm, whose journey will completely change how you see the search for belonging and the consequences of succumbing to external expectations. Where it all begins for Draco Malfoy is not just in a house, but in a true sanctuary of pure blood supremacy, Malfoy Manor, a place where every detail exuded centuries of tradition and power. From his first breaths, Draco was immersed in a universe where the Malfoy surname was more than just an identity. It was a heavy title of responsibility, a badge of distinction that demanded conformity and the perpetuation of ancestral ideals. Imagine growing up under imposing crystal chandeliers, surrounded by artifacts that told the story of an unyielding legacy, where every gesture, every word, every thought was meticulously scrutinized under the lens of a lineage that tolerated no failures. Draco never had the chance to be simply a boy with his own dreams and aspirations. He was the heir, the future of the family, and this implied unwavering adherence to the precepts of an ideology that considered blood purity not just a belief, but an absolute truth. The environment in which he developed was permeated by a constant discourse of superiority, a visceral contempt for those deemed different or unclean. This early exposure to prejudiced beliefs, coming directly from his primary authority figures, Lucius and Narcissa Malfoy, began to irrevocably shape his perception of the world. Psychologically, this upbringing aligns perfectly with Albert Bandura's social learning theory. Draco didn't just hear his parents talk about the importance of blood purity. He saw them living these principles in every interaction, in every decision. He observed Lucius in his haughty demeanor, in his disdain for mudbloods, and saw Narcissa, though more subtly, reinforced the same values through her implicit expectations. Draco learned, through observation and modeling, that approval came from conformity, from unquestioning loyalty to pure blood ideals, and from the perpetuation of the status quo. The pressure to fit into this predefined mold was immense, generating a constant and insatiable craving for validation, especially from his father. Every attitude that mirrored his family's values, every comment that denoted contempt for mudbloods, received, even if subtly, the approval he so desperately sought, reinforcing a cycle of learned behavior. But there was something no one saw coming, a crack in the seemingly unshakable foundation of his existence. The turning point in Draco's life, the trigger that began to destabilize his facade of arrogance and invulnerability, wasn't an isolated event, but a series of escalating pressures that culminated in the brutal designation to become a Death Eater. His youthful innocence, mixed with cultivated arrogance, once sustained by family protection and power, collided devastatingly with the harsh and unforgiving reality of a world under the dominance of the Dark Lord. Being a Death Eater was no longer about the status or idealized honor he saw in his father. It was about blind obedience, constant terror, and the looming threat of morally repugnant tasks. This moment of rupture exposed Draco to an overwhelming internal conflict. On one side, the crushing pressure from his parents, who saw his allegiance as the only way to ensure the family's safety and honor, and from the Dark Lord himself, who demanded unquestioning loyalty and cruel actions. On the other, a flicker of conscience, a silent voice that, despite years of indoctrination, refused to embrace the malice and cruelty imposed upon him. He wasn't an enthusiast of darkness. He was a terrified young man, forced to play a role that went far beyond his emotional and moral capabilities, a role for which he had not been prepared, despite all the family rhetoric. Psychology can explain this initial transformation through Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance theory. Draco experienced deep psychological discomfort between his internalized beliefs, which, deep down, might not have been as malevolent as his facade, and the actions he was forced to carry out. He was trained to believe in the superiority and power of his lineage, but not necessarily to inflict suffering or become an executor of atrocities. The urgent need to reduce this dissonance led him to oscillate between a desperate attempt to justify his actions seeking validation from the Dark Lord and his parents, convincing himself it was the right path, and moments of visible anguish, hesitation, and even weakness. The external conflict manifested in his increasing irritability, even more biting sarcasm and impulsive actions, a desperate attempt to mask his vulnerability and the terror he felt. He was a fish out of water, a reluctant actor in a macabre play, whose lines didn't fit with his true self. He was disintegrating under the pressure, and the cracks in his armor were beginning to become evident to those who knew how to observe. And that's when everything began to crumble. The mask was starting to break, revealing an interior far more complex and suffering than he ever let anyone see. Draco's mind, once a mirror of his family's expectations, began to distort and solidify under the weight of the obligations imposed by the Dark Lord. It was no longer just about pleasing his parents or maintaining an image. It was about his very survival and that of his family. The assigned missions, forced association with truly dark and sadistic figures, and the constant, terrifying threat of retaliation and punishment led Draco to adopt a new and dangerous layer of protection, calculated indifference, and a superficial, almost performative cruelty. Statements like, "I don't need help from filthy mudbloods," or actions such as bullying vulnerable Hogwarts students, or even his demeanor during the invasion of Malfoy Manor, revealed this new way of thinking and behaving. However, behind this facade of superiority and coldness, there was a boy desperately trying to convince himself that he was capable of meeting the demands of a ruthless world that would not hesitate to destroy him if he failed. He forced himself to act in a way he believed was expected of a true Malfoy, even if it gnawed at him internally and led to moments of panic and nausea. To get inside Draco's head, we can use the analogy of the mask of conformity and survival. He wore a cold, calculating, and at times cruel persona, not out of inherent malice, but as a defense mechanism and self-preservation tactic. With each act of cruelty he managed to perform, or at least convincingly simulate, he reinforced to himself that he was worthy of his lineage, strong enough to belong to that circle, and capable of surviving in that hostile environment. He convinced himself that, to be accepted, to ensure the safety of his family and himself, he needed to become the person they expected him to be, even if that person was a distorted and dark reflection of his true self. This process resembles social role theory, where an individual, under strong pressure, adapts and internalizes the expectations associated with a specific role, even if it directly conflicts with their pre-existing personality and deepest values. Draco, now a villain in training, was trying to live up to the role imposed upon him, acting in a play he didn't want to be a part of, and feeling the burden and incompatibility with his own moral compass, which silently screamed against every inhumane act. But the true monster was still dormant. The fragility beneath Draco's armor had not yet been fully exposed. The act of transgression that pushed Draco beyond any point of return, or at least seemed to, was the terrible and solitary task of eliminating Albus Dumbledore. This was the peak of pressure, the thin and tortuous line between forced obedience and irreversible moral condemnation. With the path clear, Dumbledore weakened, and the opportunity in his hands, Draco hesitated. He couldn't wield the wand and deliver the final blow. Not from a lack of physical ability, but from a deep and paralyzing aversion to such an extreme action, to an act of barbarity that would shock the core of his humanity. In this crucial moment, Draco's worldview began to fragment completely. He had been indoctrinated for years to believe that violence was a means to an end, that unwavering loyalty to his cause was the supreme value. However, confronted with the raw and brutal reality of the situation, Morality and ethics began to assert themselves in a way he could no longer ignore. His inability to commit the act revealed not a weakness of character, as many might interpret, but a profound and painful humanity, a part of himself he had desperately tried to hide under layers of arrogance and conformity. We can draw the audience into an existential dilemma. What if Draco's hesitation wasn't just weakness, but the last desperate spark of his humanity fighting to emerge against the expectations of a dark legacy? He had rationalized his previous actions as necessary for his family's survival and for the fulfillment of a predetermined destiny. But the reality of the final moment, the proximity of a defenseless man's death, confronted him with the impossibility of crossing such a definitive line, revealing that there was a limit to how much he was willing to lose himself in the name of obedience. He was on the edge of a precipice, and his very essence was pulling him back. This inability to act, despite the terrible consequences that failure could entail, the Dark Lord's wrath, his family's disgrace, demonstrates the force of an unbearable internal conflict. Draco was cornered, with the expectations of his legacy pushing him one way, towards darkness, and his own conscience, however muffled, desperately pulling him the other way, towards what remained of his light. It was a silent, agonizing battle. What is the price of a choice when all options seem to lead to some form of destruction, be it moral or physical? The question is disturbing, and Draco's answer, in his inaction, speaks volumes about the cost of trying to be someone you are not. Delving deeper into Draco's psychological analysis, we realize that his actions and hesitations can be understood not as manifestations of an inherently evil character or madness, but rather as the painful response of an individual under extreme coercion, social pressure, and prolonged trauma. The logic behind his destruction, his reluctant allegiance to the dark side, was, in fact, a pure logic of survival, forged in an environment where disobedience meant not only his personal ruin, but the condemnation of his entire family. We can use the concept of obedience to authority, popularized by Stanley Milgram's controversial yet revealing experiments. Although the context of a magic student differs from a laboratory, the dynamic is eerily similar. Individuals are led to act against their own morality under the influence of a perceived legitimate and punitive authority figure, in Draco's case, the Dark Lord, and to a lesser extent, his own parents, who reinforced the need for conformity for family safety. Draco was in a position where the punishment for disobeying was so severe, so overwhelming, that conformity, even if reluctant and agonizing, became the most rational option to protect those he loved, especially his mother. His oscillating behavior, arrogance, and bullying one moment, followed by moments of visible anguish, panic, and hesitation the next, was not contradictory or hypocritical, but a clear reflection of the internal battle between the persona he needed to maintain to survive in that cruel world and the person he truly was. With his fears, his moral compass, and his aversion to extreme cruelty, it was a desperate coping mechanism. He needed to be the villain in the eyes of the Dark Lord and his Death Eaters to stay alive and protect his family. But this constant performance was emotionally and psychologically exhausting him. We can compare Draco to characters, real or fictional, who find themselves compelled to act in ways that preserve their family or themselves under extreme and oppressive circumstances. His logic of destruction was, in fact, the logic of someone trying to stay standing in an earthquake, clinging to any lifeline, even if it pulled him into murky waters. He didn't choose the war, but he was dragged into it and forced to make terrible choices at one point, quite literally. It wasn't madness. It was the cold, desperate calculation of a young man, still in development, thrust into a scenario he didn't choose, seeking a way for himself and his family to survive, even if it meant losing an irreplaceable piece of his own soul. Science helps us understand that, under certain conditions, malice can be a product of environment and circumstances, not just an intrinsic moral failing. What remains after the turmoil experienced by Draco Malfoy is not a figure of heroic triumph or easy, instant redemption, but rather a deeply scarred individual, a vivid reflection of the forced choices and emotional scars that war and relentless family expectations left behind. His legacy of chaos was not that of a great evil conqueror or a tyrant, but that of a young man who was pushed to the limits of his endurance and who, in a way, was shaped and swallowed by the very system of power and prejudice he was supposed to uphold. Draco's journey leads us to discuss the real and lasting consequences of living under the yoke of extreme expectations and psychological pressure. He didn't become what his parents and the Dark Lord wanted, a ruthless Death Eater, but he also didn't emerge unscathed. His hesitation at crucial moments, his inability to commit the most terrible acts, and his visible anguish are powerful testimonies to a part of his humanity that refused to be completely extinguished. The shadow of his actions, however, remained, and the rehabilitation of his image, and more importantly, of his own psyche, was a slow, painful, and complex process. He had to reconstruct his identity outside the confines of his surname and the expectations that almost crushed him. This trajectory invites us to a profound philosophical and moral reflection. Who are we to harshly judge an individual who was conditioned from the earliest childhood, immersed in an environment of prejudice, and pushed to the limit of his choices in life or death situations? Draco Malfoy becomes a complex case study on the overwhelming influence of environment, family structure, and extreme circumstances on character formation and the decisions that shape a life. He is not a villain in the one-dimensional sense, but a victim of a legacy that overwhelmed him, a product of a system that manipulated him. His story does not end with a clear triumph or complete absolution, but with the possibility of a new beginning, a future built outside the oppressive shadows of the past. However, the mystery remains, lingering like a fog. Do the deep scars of a childhood under such pressure and an adolescence marked by war truly disappear? Or do they transform into a constant reminder of what could have been, of the cost of conformity? But perhaps true strength lies not in being who is expected, but in finding the courage, however late, to try to be who you are, even if that means defying the entire world. Draco Malfoy's story shows us that often, behind sarcasm and apparent coldness, there is just a boy searching for acceptance, a prisoner of expectations he never chose. His journey invites us to question, what is the true cost of trying to please everyone to the point of losing yourself? And how many other lives are shaped and suffocated by the weight of family legacies? Think about it. Freedom isn't always about defying the world, but about freeing yourself from the invisible chains that bind us.